Hello everybody, how's it going? Screezilla here, and I hope you're all well. And you join me today for a look at a Japanese plane. Yes, something different for once, and it's not a bomber, it is a heavy fighter. And I'm going to be looking at the KI-108, the Kawasaki 108. Now, this plane was not hugely successful in the war. Only sort of about 2 of them actually were made in total. So let's first of all start going through some of the history of this plane. So the KI-108 was a later war prototype developed by the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force and Kawasaki as a new interceptor to counter the American heavy bomber, the B-29. Why are there so many birds outside my window today? Oh, life, why must you be so annoying? Anyway, this meant they needed a plane capable of extreme altitude, upwards of 31,000 feet. That's almost 10,000 meters. A height that Americans felt somewhat safe in, especially from enemy interceptors and things like flak, because simply they were out of range of pretty much those things. Along with that, of course, the B-29 Superfortress also had a fierce defensive armament, leading to many of their airgroups being unescorted over the Japanese homeland, because well, they sort of thought, well, we don't need fighters up there, we've got this plane that has more guns than, you know, most small nations, and it's extremely high, we don't need to have some fighters tagging along. So this led to the Japanese army creating a heavy, high-altitude fighter. The main we will focus on for this moment is the KI-102, originally designed as a closer air support heavy fighter, with the bombing of the homeland becoming more and more prevalent and more of an occurrence. The Emperor needed to attack these heavy bombers. So, due to this, they used the aforementioned heavy fighter to start a plane that was capable of attacking the B-29s at such a high altitude. It was decided to equip the plane with a large 37mm autocannon being placed in the nose, which was to be used at a distance of around 700 to 1,000 meters to try and keep out of the enemy firing arc. High explosive shells were used, and they would cause severe damage to any B-29 they would hit. Had it connected, especially if it hit the pressurized cabin of the plane, it would cause an immense amount of damage due to explosive decompression. Although most of the shots were made at the inner engines, hitting the wing of that position, because it was considered a structural weak point and more reliable for getting the plane down and meaning it wouldn't return home. The biggest issue for the crew was that the Kawasaki 102 was not built for altitude. They did not have a cabin, so had to wear warm clothing and of course get oxygen through a mask, and along with this it meant the engine, which had to be equipped with sort of turbochargers for the aid of it, to be able to chase bombers at such a high altitude. With a standard canopy, the 2-man crew on board, this meant that weight was more of an issue, along with them needing either an air compressor for the crew to breathe, or to have a lot more oxygen tanks in the plane. One of the problems with a compressor, of course, is it does use up engine power, so it makes the plane slower and reduces your engine power, and that is a big thing, especially when you are at high altitudes. Piss off, birds. And of course, if they had to use multiple oxygen tanks, it would really be, well, it wouldn't be very good for the plane because it adds so much weight. So a single-seater version was needed. And this leads us to the Kawasaki 108 high-altitude interceptor, capable of keeping up and even catching B-29s, armed with the HO-203 37mm cannon and twin HO-5 20mm cannons. The only problem now was working out how to keep the pilot alive at these altitudes, and how to do so with as little weight and little sort of things to sort of cause problems to the engine as possible. Twin Mitsubishi HA-122-2 air-cooled 14-cylinder cylinder engines were equipped to the plane, and turbochargers were placed onto them through the exhaust. The only problem now was working out how to keep the pilot alive, as I say, and if they were going to fit a compressor for the oxygen, it was going to take away from the horsepower. Now, the plane had a tad over 1500 horsepower on takeoff, and more importantly, with those turbochargers, 1000 horsepower at an altitude of 32,000 feet. This meant the plane was capable of speeds up to 360 miles per hour, capable of flying at 44,000 feet, and having a range of over 1,000 miles. This did leave one small problem, however. The pilot, as it was a needed component, and the plane did have some autopilot features to it, but it wasn't advanced enough to make this plane capable of flying itself. Now, the problem is, of course, oxygen. Oxygen is a critical component for humans, and especially when you get to high altitudes, and to make this, you'll need a compressor on the engine, which is going to reduce your power, to have the pilot breathing. So what they came up with was actually a pressurized cockpit. The idea they went with was, instead of using more standard approach of making the whole cockpit pressurized, which would mean they'd have to make a heavier build, the whole new section of the KI-102 would have to be remade, they'd have to remodel it, remake the airframe, a lot of different things. So instead, a cunning plan was devised. Why not make a double glazed cockpit? We keep the regular cockpit, but now we place a secondary cabin for the pilot, which is fully pressurized, and being a smaller space would need much less oxygen to keep it fed. Chances are that after the prototype stages were done, new cockpits would have been made for the plane, but with war now in a dire place, resources were at a minimum. So they sort of decided to go with the pressurized cabin, using a sort of almost like a bull turret design. Only 4 KI-108s were produced, and still in testing, a Kai variant was made with a longer fuselage and a longer wingspan, giving it much better stability and performance at higher altitudes. The first prototype proved the plane had potential. However, in its sort of early flights, the pressurized cabin's door decided to blow out, but by some miraculous reason the test pilot did manage to get the plane back to the ground and, well, land it and not die, which is an impressive feat. And, well, that's it really. That's what we've got on a KI-108, and that's the reason this vehicle has that strange double cockpit design and that strange bull turret in the plane itself. The KI-108, as with many Japanese vehicles, had a lot of potential, and it could have been a very good plane. However, as the war was growing and as the war was going on, the Japanese Empire had little to sort of help with themselves, and it was a little bit too little too late, unfortunately. So yeah, that's the KI-108. So let's have a little talk about it in game. So in War Thunder, it's a 3.7 BR plane, and, well, in all honesty, it's not very good. There are much better planes out there, in my opinion. The biggest problem with this plane is the fact that the front-mounted cannon is extremely weak, having only a high explosive shell on board. Now, this high explosive shell seems like a brilliant thing because, well, high explosive shells on planes generally cause bits to fall off. Unfortunately, in practice, it tends to spark a lot and do very little damage, especially against bombers, which, I know it makes very little sense, but Gaijin, what do you expect? And this causes the plane to be very problematic. It has very few benefits, so to say. The guns are weak, they have very low velocity, so they're very hard to hit with. It's almost like shooting pellets out with your mouth. They really have no punch behind them, and when they do hit, there's very little damage done. The 20mm as well feel a little bit anemic and aren't as good as some of the others. The plane handles relatively well, I have to give it that. It's not a bad plane for its handling. With that slightly larger tail section and the wings, it does have good performance. Even at low altitude, it handles very well. High altitude, this thing is very good, but you're not going to win any turn battles with anyone. You will struggle a lot with this plane. you'll get a lot of people coming head on to you, and you'd think, well, this plane should be pretty good for a head on. Unfortunately, there's no armour for the pilot, so you tend to find that in a head-on situation you become the loser because, well, as I say, your pilot is taken out very, very quickly. You usually get sort of, I've been getting around about 1 kill a match, which is not too bad in all honesty, but it's not great either. The 20mm as well, even with ground target belts in them, are very poor for causing damage to ground targets, as you just saw a full strafe run on enemy boats there using the 20mm guns only, because we had run out of the 37mm cannon. The 37mm cannon does do some good damage to light ground targets, so things like vehicles and landing craft. It will take them out in pretty much one shot, but you don't have much ammo. It's very limited at what it can do. The plane is great for having a interesting vehicle in the game. It's a very interesting plane, very interesting concept, very interesting design. Having that hermetically sealed cockpit is, again, a very interesting thing to see, because it's just very strange. You don't see that very often. If we actually just quickly go to the camera here, you can see the cockpit quite well. So there's the little bubble, and once the cockpit doors do open up, you'll be able to see it again quite well. Being a double glazed cockpit, it does help a lot. One of the biggest problems for this plane in real life, in history, was the fact that it was a very hot cockpit, because it... there we go. There we go, we've opened up the cockpit now so we can sort of see. Now let's see if we can actually get this horrible, horrible free camera for working. So as we spin around here, you can see that that dome in the cockpit there, and you can just see how it sits on the pilot. It's almost like a long oblong tube thing that the pilot and all the controls sit in, and then the rest of it is open. You can see the oxygen tanks just behind the pilot there, feeding the oxygen into the plane itself. Now, from what I can find from history, the plane had oxygen tanks on board, and just recycled its oxygen in that respect, rather than having sort of its own, rather than having a compressor, as I say, because that would have eaten it into the engine power. As I said, in game, unfortunately, this plane is a bit of a dud. You will find with the 20mm, they will do really no damage. You have to rely on that 37mm cannon to do anything in this vehicle, and you can't really outturn anything in this plane. It is a heavy fighter, but still, I've seen some better heavy fighters in turn fights. Its engines heat up way too quickly and overheat, and as I was saying before, just in reality, the pilots often struggled from the heat of the plane because there was no cooling in that hermetically sealed cockpit, and they would often get quite hot and get quite sick from it, which was not a good thing for a plane. Being early prototype stages, this is to be expected though. The engines, though, they overheat way too quickly. If you run this plane on 100% throttle, you will find that your plane overheats almost instantly. The plane is sort of very problematic for that. You have to be very good with your engine control. And as you can see there, with that 37mm back on board, we can just absolutely annihilate those landing craft. One of the biggest problems as well is the bullet velocity. As I said, it's got a very low velocity, which means you have to be quite close to engage to guarantee hits, and in a turn fight I find it very hard because I find the shells just miss my target even though I think they're going to actually hit. Do a nice strafing run over there and get about 5 or 6 targets down, which is always nice, and we're going to head over to the other island. But this match is pretty much done. We actually do get a win. The final plane is shot down, and I'm going to end the episode here anyway, because there's not much more to talk about on this plane really. I hope you've enjoyed this and found it somewhat interesting, and now understand why this plane has that strange cockpit configuration, and I will do more videos on like this in the future, so please subscribe to the channel if you found this one interesting. Alright guys, until later even, this is me, Scree, out. Also, thankfully all the birds have shut up once I stopped recording, of course, bastard birds.